I am your boss. Effective at 9 a.m. today.
Call security. Take this woman out of here.
Renee? Renee, Walter's daughter?
6 years ago, I filed this fraud complaint. Nobody bothered to read it for 3 years. Not until the Securities and Exchange Commission officially stepped in.
That's impossible. The board appointment isn't supposed to take effect until Monday.
Today is Monday, and it's 9:15.
I always read all of your comments. If you want me to tell you more inspiring stories about human kindness, sacrifice, and how justice eventually catches up with cruel people, type billionaire single mom in the comments section below. At 6 in the morning, Renee Coleman's office sat on the 3rd floor of an old building in downtown Charlotte, where the rent was far cheaper than the shiny glass towers a few blocks away. She arrived earlier than usual, even though the office had long been used to her, showing up before 7 every day for the past 6 years. On her desk, beside a stack of files she had read so many times the paper corners were beginning to curl, sat a small wooden picture frame. Walter Coleman stood in front of the Kane Meridian Group warehouse, wearing a Navy uniform with a 20-year service patch embroidered on the left side of his chest. He was smiling in the photo, the kind of smile worn by a man who took pride in the work he did, unaware that 3 years after that moment, he would receive a termination notice stating that his position had been eliminated due to operational restructuring. Renee opened the file one last time, not because she didn't already know every page. She had read the material so many times she could quote each clause without looking. But this was a ritual she had made for herself years earlier, every time she was about to enter a major legal fight. Read from the beginning, slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. Under the file was a second, thinner folder containing the list of what she needed to carry with her today. The settlement agreement approved by the federal court, the appointment confirmation from the Pension Fund Coalition, and the authorization letter from Dr. Ashworth, allowing Renee to speak publicly on her behalf if necessary. She had checked that list 3 times over the past week, not because she was afraid she would forget anything, but because checking it had become the way she kept herself steady before major events. The copy of the whistleblower complaint sat on the first page of the file, the corner yellowed with age, the old folds worn so thin that in some places they were almost transparent. She folded it and placed it in a separate compartment of her brown leather briefcase, along with the settlement agreement approved by the federal court and the appointment confirmation from the Pension Fund Coalition. She looked at the clock. 6:15, 3 hours left. She poured coffee into the metal travel mug she had carried every day since she was still an accountant, a habit that had never changed even after her work and status had changed completely. She stood by the window, looking down at the street that was still mostly empty, thinking about what would happen in the next few hours. Not with anxiety, but with something close to the calm of a person who had prepared long enough that there was nothing left to fear. Outside, Charlotte was still quiet, under the pale blue light of early morning. A few garbage trucks moved slowly down the street, collecting bins before rush hour began. Renee watched one truck until it disappeared around the corner, then turned back to her desk, folded her coat neatly over the back of her chair, and prepared to put it on at 8:30, exactly as planned. At 8:47, Renee walked through the revolving doors of the Kane Meridian Group building. She did not call ahead to warn Preston Kane. That had been agreed upon clearly with the shareholder coalition's attorneys from the start. The announcement had to happen without warning, at the exact time specified in the settlement agreement, to avoid giving Kane time to lobby, pressure board members who were still wavering, or worse, move financial documents before the audit team arrived. The main lobby was wide, with high ceilings and pale beige marble floors reflecting the lights above. A large glass wall ran along the west, letting morning light flood in and casting long shadows from the decorative plants placed around the waiting area. Renee walked straight toward the reception desk, her steps steady, not rushed. Otis Meade stood behind the security desk near the entrance, as he had for 24 years. He had watched thousands of people pass through those revolving doors, enough to recognize the difference between an ordinary visitor and someone carrying something important. He looked at the woman who had just walked in a little longer than usual, the way someone looks when trying to match a familiar face to a version changed by time. Something in the way she walked, in the way she held her head straight as she crossed the lobby, kept him from looking away, even though he could not yet place exactly what it was. Renee did not stop to greet him right away. She walked near the waiting area, set her briefcase on the leather sofa nearby, and checked her watch. 8:48. 12 minutes left before the public announcement would officially begin according to the agreed schedule. At 8:52, hurried footsteps came from the left corridor leading to the executive offices. Preston Kane appeared with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice so loud it carried across the lobby even though he wasn't trying. I don't care whether the Meridian Capital delegation confirmed their arrival time. I need to know exactly what they're going to ask about the Q3 report. You told me 10 minutes ago everything was ready, and now you're telling me the conference room doesn't have the presentation screen set up. He crossed the lobby, eyes fixed on some empty point in the air, speaking like a man trying to handle 3 problems at once in his head. He did not see Renee right away, even though she stood only a few steps from the main path. As he was about to pass, his leg bumped the briefcase resting on the sofa arm, shifting it slightly. He stopped, frowned, looked down, then looked up at the woman standing there. "Excuse me, this area is reserved for VIP guests waiting for meetings," he said, his voice still irritated from the call. "Do you have an appointment with someone?" Rennie looked at him for a moment before answering. She had thought about this moment many times over the past 6 years. Not like imagining a dramatic movie scene, but the way a lawyer prepares testimony. Preciseness, no excess, nothing missing. "I don't need an appointment," she said. Kane looked at her more carefully now, assessing the dark blue suit she wore, the brown leather briefcase, the way she stood upright without showing the slightest confusion at the clear annoyance in his voice. He did not recognize her. 6 years and a completely different career had changed a lot about the woman who had once been a low-level accountant in this very building. "Do you have any idea how many things I have to deal with this morning?" he said, his voice fully shifting into impatience. "The institutional investor delegation will be here in a few minutes, and I don't have time to deal with anything that isn't on the schedule." "I know," Renee replied. "I'm one of them." Kane stopped. There was a brief pause, long enough for him to process the sentence he had just heard, but not long enough for him to understand what it meant. "What does that mean?" He pulled out his phone, apparently about to call someone to verify whether there was a meeting he had forgotten. His finger moved across the screen, but his eyes stayed on Renee. "Who are you?" he asked again, this time with more threat in his voice, the voice of a man used to having every question answered immediately, without exception. Otis, from behind the security desk, had begun stepping away from his post, slowly but firmly, as if some part of him had sensed something was about to happen before it happened. Renee placed her hand on the clasp of her briefcase but did not open it yet. She looked directly into Kane's eyes. "I'm your boss," she said, her voice no louder than normal and not shaking. "Effective 9 o'clock this morning." For one moment the lobby went completely still, the kind of stillness that only happens when a sentence sounds so impossible that no one, including the person hearing it, knows how to react in the first half-second. Then Kane's hand swung. The sound cracked through the lobby, loud enough for 3 people near the elevator bank to turn and look. Renee's head tilted to one side from the force of the slap, her hair falling across part of her face for a split second. She did not lift a hand to hold her cheek. She did not step back. She stood still, let her hair fall back into place, then turned her head and looked straight at Kane again, the red mark already beginning to show on her left cheek. "Call security," Kane said, louder than necessary, aiming the words at no one in particular, in the way of a man trying to convince the room that he was still controlling the situation, even though he was no longer sure that was true. "This woman doesn't work here. She has no right to be standing here." Otis had come closer, stopping about 3 feet from them. He looked at Renee's face, more carefully this time, and something in his expression changed slowly, as if the final piece of a puzzle had finally locked into place after years of sitting loose in memory. "Rennie," he said, his voice small, almost not believing itself. Rennie Coleman. Kane's hand, still half raised from the slap, lowered a little more. The corner of the lobby, near a marble column, a young woman in a gray suit stood quietly, with her phone held horizontally at chest level, facing forward, the lens pointed directly at Kane and Renee. She had started recording from the moment Kane entered the lobby, exactly as instructed by the Shareholder Coalition's office that morning. Record the full announcement process in accordance with legal requirements, and do not miss a single moment. No one in the lobby, including Renee, knew she was standing there. Renee opened her briefcase. Inside, the copy of the whistleblower complaint sat on top, yellowed corner, worn fold lines. She pulled it out and placed it on the nearby reception desk, right in front of Kane. 6 years ago, she said, I filed this. Nobody read it for 3 years. The Securities and Exchange Commission finally did. Kane looked down at the paper. His eyes moved over the lines, but the information did not seem to fully enter his mind right away. The delayed reaction of someone receiving a shock too large to process at the same time as the anger still running through his bloodstream. That's not possible, he said. The board appointment notice doesn't take effect until next Monday. Today is Monday, Renee replied. 9:15. Otis still stood there, unmoving, his eyes shifting from Kane to Renee and back again. After a moment, he took one more step, standing between them, his tall frame creating a physical boundary that needed no explanation. Mr. Kane, he said, his voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from something held inside him for a long time finally finding a way out. This is Walter Coleman's daughter. Preston Kane looked at Otis. Then he looked back at Renee. Something flickered across his face, not doubt about her identity. Because the name had clearly stirred something in his memory, even if he had not yet processed its full meaning. It was another kind of doubt, slower and deeper. The doubt of a man realizing he might have just done something he could not take back, on camera, in front of witnesses, on the most important morning of his schedule. Looked down at his hand, the same hand that had swung only seconds earlier, as if trying to understand exactly what it had just done. Then he looked around the lobby for the first time since coming out of the office corridor, noticing the 3 people near the elevator bank who still had not looked away. Noticing the young woman in the gray suit standing quietly in the corner with the phone still held at chest level. Outside the glass doors, 3 small vans with the logos of local financial television stations were slowly pulling into the visitor lot, right on time, exactly as scheduled under the settlement agreement with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The doors opened. People carrying cameras and microphones began stepping out, not rushing, because they knew exactly why they had come and when they needed to begin recording. Renee did not turn to look at them yet. She still stood there, one hand resting on the copy of the whistleblower complaint on the reception desk, waiting for the next moment with the patience of someone who had learned how to wait across 6 long years, and knew that a few more minutes were nothing compared to that. Otis Meade stood between Preston Kane and Renee Coleman like an old door that had decided this time. No one was getting through. He did not shove the CEO of Kane Meridian Group. He did not touch Renee either, though the red mark on her cheek was showing clearly under the lobby lights. He only stood there, both feet planted on the marble floor, looking at the man whose car door he had opened for more than 20 years. Mr. Kane, he said, his voice low but clear enough for the reception desk to hear, this is Walter Coleman's daughter. The name dropped into the lobby like an old key, finally finding the right lock. Preston Kane blinked. A man like Kane didn't remember warehouse worker by this, but he remembered files when they had once created problems. Renee remained straight-backed, the yellowed copy of the whistleblower complaint tucked against her leather folder. She did not rub her cheek. She had learned long ago that in rooms with power, your first reaction could be used to rewrite the story. 25 years before that morning, Walter Coleman arrived at the Kane Meridian warehouse on the west side of Charlotte at 5:38 a.m., 22 minutes before his official shift. He did that every day, not because anyone paid him extra, but because the packaging conveyor tended to jam at the 3rd roller if it wasn't started early. That year marked Walter's 19th year with the company. His dark blue uniform shirt had a small patch that read 20 years of service, even though the official ceremony had not happened yet. Walter opened the equipment checklist, then stopped at the line for the previous month's warehouse maintenance costs. The number wasn't strange, $1,400 for inspection and lid replacement of South Bay roll-up door components. What was strange was that no one had replaced any components on the South Bay door in nearly a year. He knew because he was the one who called the repair crew every time it jammed, and that month, it had only needed grease. Walter was not an accountant. He was a warehouse manager. He knew pallet weights, truck schedules, and the names of the employees who hid sandwiches in the second refrigerator. But almost 20 years was enough for a man to understand the rhythm of money moving through the place where he worked. When a maintenance charge kept appearing and there was no smell of fresh paint, no contractor signing in, no invoice pinned to the technical board, A man like Walter would see it the way he saw a box placed on the wrong shelf, photocopied 3 pages of expenses, clipped them to the monthly report, and carried them upstairs to the operations manager's office. The manager at the time, Harlan Voss, took the papers and said he would look into it. Harlan placed the file in his inbox and did not open it in front of Walter. 3 weeks later, Walter asked about it again. Harlan said accounting had probably handled it. The next month, the charge appeared again, renamed Ventilation Systems Safety Inspection. Walter stood under the old ceiling fan during his lunch break, looked at the time clock, then folded the copy of the report into his locker. He had 3 years left before qualifying for his full pension. For a man who had raised a daughter alone through community college, repaired a car with tax refund money, and learned never to let health insurance lapse even for 1 month, 3 years was an entire bridge that could not be allowed to collapse. Renee knew pieces of that when she was younger, but only as fragments her father dropped at the kitchen table and stopped before they became accusations. Some numbers at the warehouse aren't clean. Walter once said while taking off his work boots, his feet swollen after a 12-hour shift. At the time, Renee was studying accounting at night, working part-time at the library and helping her father pay bills. She asked if anyone in the company knew. Walter said someone had to know because numbers didn't walk into the books by themselves. Then he changed the subject and asked if she had eaten. Years later, after Renee had become a second-year attorney at a small firm specializing in corporate fraud cases, she took on a file that had nothing to do with Kane Meridian. A pension fund for factory workers in Georgia had been drained through routine equipment maintenance payments sent to 3 shell companies. Renee was sitting in a conference room at 9 p.m., reading the phrase warehouse maintenance allocation, when her fingers stopped on the line. The phrase pulled her father's voice back across the years from that kitchen table. Some numbers at the warehouse aren't clean. She did not rush straight at Kane Meridian. A young attorney couldn't turn instinct into a lawsuit. Renee began with public, boring things: annual reports, financial notes, vendor records, North Carolina business registrations, company pensions and restructuring notices, and related party disclosures in SEC filings. Every time she saw a recurring expense with a different description but the same vendor address, she entered it into a spreadsheet. Every time that address led to a shared office in Raleigh or an LLC formed only 2 months earlier, she did not write a conclusion. She only saved the evidence. She had studied law long enough to know anger is fuel, not proof. In his 22nd year at Kane Meridian, Walter was called into HR on a Friday morning. He wore his cleanest uniform shirt because he thought it might be a meeting about his service milestone. He was 3 months away from full pension eligibility. Renee remembered that number very clearly because her father had circled the date in red on the wall calendar, not to celebrate in some big way, but so he would know when he could schedule a more serious heart exam without worrying about losing work hours. In the HR room, Harlan Voss sat beside a young woman from corporate HR. On the table was a packet labeled Operational Restructuring Notice. Harlan did not look at Walter for long. The HR woman read from the document saying the company was restructuring warehouses operations. Certain positions would be eliminated, and the decision was not a reflection of individual performance. Walter asked about the severance package. She said he would receive 2 weeks of pay and COBRA information by mail. His group health insurance would end in 30 days. Walter sat still, hands resting on his knees. He's Kane Meridian, cap folded in his lap. He asked whether his pension milestone 3 months away could be considered. Harlan said the decision had been approved at a higher level. That same week, Walter's cardiologist asked Renee to come with him to an appointment. His heart valve had gotten worse since the last checkup. If he still had stable insurance, the doctor wanted to operate within a few months. Walter listened and only asked what the out-of-pocket cost would be after insurance. Renee remembered the way the doctor looked down at the file, then asked how long his current coverage would remain active. When they walked out to the parking lot, Walter told Renee there would be a way. He said people had survived worse things than a company restructuring, but when he opened the door of the old Ford, his hand stayed on the handle longer than usual. Renee saw it, but she said nothing. There are moments when children see their parents fighting to keep their posture, and the only way not to hurt them more is to pretend they didn't see. 6 years before the morning Preston Kane slapped her, Renee filed an anonymous whistleblower complaint at 2:03 a.m. She had spent months cross-checking public records, tracing connections between warehouse maintenance vendors, consulting fees, LLCs formed and dissolved, and accounts tied to people close to Preston Kane. She did not have access to internal files. She did not have email records. She did not have enough protection to sign her real name, because at the time she was still a young attorney with student loans and a last seen that some old people at Kane Meridian might recognize. The complaint was 47 pages long, not counting attachments. She clearly marked what she knew, what she had inferred, and which points needed SEC subpoenas to verify. Before clicking submit, she looked at the framed photo of her father on her desk. A picture, Walter stood in front of the Kane Meridian warehouse, holding a box of donuts for the morning shift, smiling like a man who still believed a company could do wrong and then correct itself if someone explained it clearly enough. Renee clicked submit. She sat there looking at the confirmation code until the screen dimmed on its own. 3 years later, that complaint was still sitting still, or at least Renee thought it was. No one called. No one sent a request for more information. There was no sign that a federal investigator had read the 47 pages she had written at 2 in the morning. During those 3 years, she took other cases, moved to a bigger firm, and learned how to stand in front of senior partners without lowering her voice when they interrupted her. But a folder named Walter stayed inside her encrypted drive. Every quarter, when Kane Meridian filed a new report, she downloaded it. Every time she saw a line item change its name without changing its substance, she added it to the spreadsheet. For 3 years, the whistleblower complaint sat inside an overloaded system. Renee did not know whether it would ever be read, but she kept building the file and she kept waiting, because delayed justice does not mean justice will never arrive. Walter Coleman died 2 years after being fired. Not in a dramatic scene, not on the warehouse floor or in front of the company gates. He died on a rainy morning in a recovery room, after heart complications that the doctor said could likely have been better managed if surgery was done earlier, and follow-up care had been more complete. Renee sat beside him all through the night before, rereading a folded hospital bill, not because there was anything left to pay at that moment, but because her hands needed something to do. Walter woke for a little while before dawn. He looked at her, looked at the document bag beneath her chair, and asked if she had eaten. Even near the end of his strength, he asked that question out of habit. Renee said yes. He looked at her long enough to know she was lying, but he did not correct her. He only said very softly, "Don't let them think people like me are invisible." She held his hand. The hand that had moved pallets, repaired shelves, and signed delivery logs was now so light she was afraid that holding too tightly would hurt him. After he died, Renee did not cry right away. She walked into the hallway, called the funeral home using the number the nurse had given her, then sat down in the plastic chair beside the vending machine. 10 minutes later, she opened her phone, went into the Walter folder, and renamed it the complaint she filed years ago. When the SEC finally contacted her, it came as a short email from an investigator whose name Renee had never heard. They did not say the case was certain. They only asked whether she could provide additional supporting materials for the whistleblower complaint filed 3 years earlier. But Renee read the email in the elevator at the federal courthouse in Raleigh. The doors opened on the 6th floor, and she still did not step out. The person behind her had to say, "Excuse me," to get around her. That night, she sent the updated cross-reference file she had been building for 3 years, with dates, file codes, vendors, addresses, company links, and points that needed subpoenas. In the final notes section, she did not mention the hospital, did not mention her father, did not mention his last words. She only wrote that the transaction patterns showed a possible diversion of employee pension assets through fabricated operating expenses and related vendors. Legal writing has no room for a father's last breath, but every line was written because of it. The investigation lasted another 3 years. Some weeks, investigators asked for documents within 48 hours. Once, she had to sit in her car in the office parking lot near midnight and call back a former Kane Meridian employee who had worked in accounting but was afraid to be recorded. Another time, Elliot Bramwell, Kane Meridian's CFO, appeared indirectly in an email chain the SEC allowed her to see in limited form, only as the initials EB at the bottom of an approval. Renee looked at those 2 letters longer than necessary. She remembered Elliot when he was still a young finance manager, walking past the accounting area, where she had worked in a low-level role without looking at anyone for more than 2 seconds. She only knew that one day, if the file became heavy enough, the quiet people would have to decide who they still wanted to be quiet for. And on that Monday morning, inside the main lobby of Kane Meridian Group, The file was finally heavy enough to return to where everything had started. Renee still stood behind Otis, her left cheek heating with each pulse, the old copy of the whistleblower complaint in her hand. Preston Kane looked from Otis to her, then around the lobby as if searching for someone who could make the morning turn back into a normal workish schedule. The young assistant near the reception corner still held the phone, the camera aimed at the, not shaking much, exactly as the legal rehearsal had instructed. Kane saw the phone last. His eyes stopped on it, then moved back to Renee. The anger on his face shifted into caution, but too late. Renee stepped forward half a pace without needing Otis to fully move aside. "You just gave the SEC another video exhibit," she said, her voice still even, right in front of the investor delegation arriving in 20 minutes. Kane did not answer right away. He looked toward the glass doors at the front, where the first news vans had appeared in the visitor lot. Then he looked at the phone still recording. The man who had once believed everything inside this building was under his control finally realized one thing had already left his hands the moment he touched Renee Coleman's face. At 9:03 a.m., the main lobby of Kane Meridian Group had still not returned to normal order, even though everyone who worked in that building had been trained to pretend things were normal, even when they had just cracked open right in front of them. An assistant at the reception desk was still holding her phone low at chest level, the lens aimed at Renee Coleman and Preston Kane. Otis Meade stood between them, not touching anyone, but his position was clear enough for Kane to understand that if he wanted to take one more step, he would have to go through a man who had worked security here for 24 years. The red mark on Renee's left cheek was plain under the lobby lights. Kane looked at the phone, looked at Otis, then looked at Renee. For the first time since slapping her, he lowered his voice. "We should discuss this privately." He said it like a man proposing something reasonable, as if only seconds earlier his hand had not cracked across a woman's face in the middle of the company lobby. Renee did not move. She placed the yellowed copy of the whistleblower complaint on the reception counter, right beneath the young assistant's slightly trembling hand. "There's nothing to discuss privately," she said. "The decision has been formally announced under the settlement terms with the SEC." Kane glanced toward the executive elevators. It was used to handling crises in conference rooms with frosted glass doors, where lawyers could polish every sentence before anyone had time to say something true. "You're misunderstanding the process," he said. "A board notice doesn't take effect unless the CEO has been fully briefed." Renee looked at the clock mounted above the market index screen in the lobby. "You were briefed in writing at 7:30 yesterday morning. Your legal office confirmed receipt at 7:42. Temporary voting authority transferred at 9 on this morning. It is now 9:03. Kane gave a very small laugh with no humor in it. "You think reading a few lines in a settlement agreement is enough to run a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars?" Renee did not answer the insult. She pulled the low chair near the reception counter toward her, not to sit, only to set the file on it so her hands were free. "I'm not running the company this morning. I'm supervising the fact that you don't destroy more evidence, don't pressure witnesses, and don't make false statements to investors." Otis turned his head and looked at her for a brief second. At 9:06, there were 14 minutes left before the investor delegation walked in. Kane took out his phone. He did not call his assistant, did not call internal communications, but went straight to his private attorney, Malcolm Price, the man who had handled every unpleasant matter involving the Kane family for 15 years. The call rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Kane immediately called again. This time it rang only twice. "Malcolm, call me back right now," he said into the voicemail, keeping his voice low though his jaw was clenched. "There's a situation in the main lobby. I need you here before anyone says anything." Renee watched him finish recording. "Mr. Price is on his way here." Kane looked up. "You don't know where my lawyer is?" "I do, because his office confirmed attendance for the 9:20 meeting under Section 4.2. She opened a tab in the file and pulled out a printed attendee list. Malcolm Price's name sat below the representative from the North Carolina Teachers Pension Fund Coalition, and above the financial media team invited to record the public announcement. At 9:08, Kane tried a different route. He turned toward the assistant still holding the phone. "Turn that off." Her name was Marissa Vale, 24 years old, newly assigned to the investor relations team only 6 weeks earlier, through a consulting firm Kane had assumed was just an ordinary media agency. In fact, the contract clearly stated that Marissa was tasked with recording the oversight transfer announcement for transparency compliance. The shareholder coalition's attorneys had instructed her not to argue, not to interrupt, and not to lower the phone if pressure occurred before the delegation arrived. Even so, her hand was damp with sweat. Kane looked at her with an expression that said her career would be shorter than his anger. Marissa swallowed, but she did not turn the phone off. Renee stepped half a pace to the side so Kane would not block the lens. She's carrying out the official recording requirement of the Temporary Oversight Board. Kane looked at Renee. You've turned my company lobby into a stage. No, Renee said. You did that when you slapped me here instead of reading the email from your own lawyer. The people near the elevators heard that clearly. A woman from HR raised her hand to her mouth, then lowered it right away, as if she was afraid even that movement might be recorded. At 9:10 a.m., the executive elevator doors opened. Elliot Bramwell stepped out with a dark blue folder tucked under one arm. He wore a gray suit, navy tie, and thin-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who had built an entire career around never looking panicked in front of other people. But his steps slowed when he saw the lobby. Kane turned sharply, as if he had finally found the person who could pull everything back into the system. Elliot. There was an order inside his voice. Elliot looked at Kane first, then at Otis, then at Marissa recording on her phone, then at Renee. He recognized her immediately. 6 years earlier, Elliot had signed some of the documents connected to the warehouse maintenance costs, Renee included in the whistleblower complaint. Not all of them. Not enough to make him the architect of the scheme, but enough that every time the SEC sent a subpoena, he knew it had not come from nowhere. He had once seen Walter Coleman's name in an old email, attached to a note that read, "Warehouse issue escalated by employee, close no action." He had also seen Walter's termination file expedited 3 months before full pension eligibility, under Harlan Voss's signature and a financial approval from Elliot's department. That year, Elliot told himself he had only signed according to process. 6 years later, that sentence sounded weaker in his head every day. Renee looked at him, did not greet him, did not bring up the past. She only looked long enough for Elliot to understand she remembered. Kane spoke quickly. "Tell her any notice has to go through the CEO before media walks in." Elliot opened his mouth, then stopped. He looked at the red handprint on Renee's cheek. That was not the part he had prepared himself to face that morning. He had known about the oversight agreement. He had known Preston would temporarily lose voting control. He had known the delegation was coming at 9:20. But he had not known Preston would slap the new board representative on camera in the main lobby. Some actions make every legal defense strategy look cheap in an instant. At 9:12 a.m., 8 minutes remained. Elliot still stood between the elevator doors and the reception desk, the blue folder pressed tightly against his body. In those 8 minutes, years of silence crossed his face faster than the numbers scrolling across the market screen. Silence had made him CFO. Silence had paid for his daughter's private school tuition. Silence had bought the house in Myers Park, bonus shares, front row seats at charity events, and the right to be called by Preston Kane, a man who knows how to keep a cool head. Silence had also given him mornings where he sat in his car outside the office longer than necessary, not wanting to walk in because he knew he would sign one more thing that left someone else with no way to fight back. Kane stepped closer to him. "Elliot." This time his voice was lower, sharper. "You're standing on the wrong side." Elliot looked down at the file. On the first page was a copy of Section 4.2 of the SEC settlement agreement, the one he had printed at 6:30 that morning after reading it for the 4th time. It stated clearly, once the institutional shareholder coalition assumed temporary voting authority, the CEO was restricted from speaking on behalf of the company about matters under investigation unless a representative of the oversight board was present. It also stated that all material investor announcements must be publicly recorded. Elliot knew every line. He had known this day would come. He simply had not known whether he would still have enough courage to say it out loud before someone else forced him to. Renee did not push him. That made the decision harder. If she attacked, he could defend himself. If she pleaded, he could hide behind helplessness. But she only stood there, cheek red, her hand beside the old whistleblower complaint, leaving the empty space to him. Otis looked at Elliot with the eyes of someone who had seen too many people pass through this lobby with their own private reasons for staying silent. Marissa kept recording, pressing her lips together to keep her hand from shaking. At 9:15 a.m., 5 minutes remained. Elliot stepped toward the reception desk. Each step was small, but it sounded clear in the lobby because no one was talking. He placed the blue folder beside Renee's copy of the complaint. "Preston," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I think you should read Section 4.2 of the settlement agreement again, before you say anything else on camera." Kane looked at the folder as if it had been placed there by a stranger. "What are you doing?" Elliot opened the cover and turned the page toward Kane. "I'm trying to stop you from making another mistake." Kane gave one short laugh. "Mistakey?" He pointed toward Renee. "She walked into my building, declared herself on behalf of the board, provoked a situation in front of employees, and you're calling me the one making mistakes?" Elliot looked at the red mark on Renee's face again. "That situation is on video." Kane turned toward Marissa. "I said turn it off." This time Otis took half a step toward the assistant, not to block the camera, but to block Kane's direct line of sight to her. "Mr. Kane," Otis said, "it would be best to let her do her job." Kane looked at Otis the way a man looks at an object in his building that has suddenly moved on its own. "Your security." Otis did not change his voice. "Yes, and this morning I'm protecting the building from further damage." That made Kane's face darken. Renee looked at Otis, but he did not look back. He kept his eyes on Kane. At 9:17 a.m., 3 minutes remained. Kane turned toward Elliot. His voice no longer tried to sound calm. "How long have you known about this?" Elliot placed both hands on the edge of the counter, not to look strong, but because he needed something to steady himself. "Long enough to know today was coming." Kane looked at him as if that answer was worse than betrayal. "You draw a salary from this company?" "I draw a salary from the company," Elliot said. "Not from you." The sentence was not loud, but it made a marketing employee near the marble column lift her head. Kane moved closer. Elliot did not step back. "I've been quiet too long," he said. "I won't lie on camera to buy you 3 more minutes." Only then did Renee speak again. "Mr. Kane, the delegation arrives in 3 minutes. You have the right to have counsel present. You have the right not to make a statement. But you do not have the right to obstruct the announcement required by the federally approved settlement." Kane turned back to her. "You keep talking as if you've won." Renee looked directly at him. "I'm talking as someone who has read the documents." The answer was not sharper than the slap, but it lasted longer. Kane looked around the lobby, searching for a face that stood with him. No one stepped forward, not because they loved Renee. Many of them still did not know who she was, but they had just watched their CEO slap a woman, call security, threaten the person recording, and then be reminded by his own CFO to reread the SEC settlement. Some mornings, an organization does not need an official announcement for everyone to understand who is creating the risk. At 9:19 a.m., 1 minute remained. Outside the glass doors, 3 black vehicles turned into the visitor lot, not limousines, but just 3 contract SUVs, the kind that carry people from the airport to meetings they have prepared for over many months. Malcolm Price stepped out of the first vehicle, phone pressed to his ear, his eyes already fixed on the lobby before the door closed behind him. From the second vehicle, 2 representatives from the shareholder coalition stepped out with a woman carrying a laptop bag marked with the North Carolina Teachers Pension Fund logo. The third vehicle carried the financial media team, 3 reporters, 2 camera operators, and an audio technician with a cable bag slung over his shoulder. They did not run. They walked quickly in the manner of people who knew they had arrived on time and did not need to apologize for it. Inside, Marissa lowered the phone slightly to widen the frame, but still did not turn it off. Renee picked up a copy of the whistleblower complaint and gently smoothed the softened corner of the paper. Otis stepped back half a pace so he would not block the entrance, but he stayed near Renee. Elliot closed the folder and held it against his chest, as if he had finally decided where he was going to carry it. Kane straightened his tie, an old gesture from a man who had once used appearance to reset the order of a room. But the red mark on Renee's cheek could not be straightened. It was there, clear under the lobby lights, right as the glass doors opened and the reporters walked in with their cameras already on. A female reporter looked at Renee first, then at Kane, then at the phone in Marissa's hand. She did not ask who had given permission to record. She only lifted her microphone, right as the clock on the market screen changed to 9:20. At 9:20 a.m., the glass doors of Kane Meridian Group's main lobby opened. Before anyone inside the company had time to decide whose side they were supposed to stand on, 3 reporters entered with 2 cameras and an audio technician carrying a cable bag over his shoulder. They knew this was the announcement scheduled under the transparency terms of the SEC settlement agreement. The woman leading them looked at the red mark on Renee Coleman's cheek, before looking at the Kane Meridian name on the stone wall behind her. Her microphone was already on. Marissa was still recording from the corner of the reception desk. Otis Meade stood slightly to one side, but still close enough that Preston Kane could not step directly toward Renee without going through him. Preston Kane straightened his tie out of old habit. The tie wasn't crooked, but his hand needed something to do. Malcolm Price, his private attorney, walked in behind the reporters, his face tightening when he saw the scene before anyone had even explained it to him. Elliot Bramwell placed the blue folder on the reception counter beside the old copy of the whistleblower complaint. Renee did not speak right away. She looked at the clock on the market screen as it changed to 9:20, then looked at Marissa. "Does that angle show the counter clearly?" Marissa nodded. Renee placed the yellowed copy of the whistleblower complaint in front of the lens. The paper no longer lay completely flat. The left corner had softened from 6 years of being taken out, reread, put away, then taken out again. "This is the complaint I filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission 6 years ago," she said, her voice normal, "when I was still a junior accountant at this company." A reporter raised her microphone closer. Preston opened his mouth, but Malcolm quickly placed a hand on his elbow. It was a legal warning made out of flesh. Renee did not mention the red mark on her cheek. She only pointed to the dateline on the complaint. "On March 14, I reported recurring warehouse maintenance expenses, recorded across multiple quarters with no repair invoices, no equipment inspection logs, and no matching contractor entries in the warehouse visitor records. At that time, I didn't have enough access to internal files to conclude where the money went. I could only identify the pattern." She turned to the first attachment. 3 vendors with different names, all registered to the same address. 2 separate consulting contracts, both routing payments through the same intermediary account. A 1 employee pension fund allocation adjusted in the same quarter as those payments. The lobby did not get noisy. It only changed the way it breathed. Employees standing near the elevators did not know whether to look at Renee or at Kane. Someone from internal communications held a tablet, tapping the screen and then stopping because there was no prepared statement for a former junior accountant returning with an SEC complaint in front of cameras. Renee continued. For the first 3 years, the complaint was not formally opened. During that time, Kane Meridian continued filing financial reports with the same category of expenses, only changing the names. Warehouse maintenance became operational optimization, then logistics safety services, then facilities consulting. The language changed just enough for a casual reader to pass over it. The money did not. She placed one finger on a transaction code table. The SEC reopened the file after these payments appeared in employee pension fund data. Preston Kane gave a laugh, but it stopped quickly when no one joined him. "You're interpreting accounting documents in front of the media as if you're a court." Renee looked up. "No. The federal court has already approved the settlement agreement. Today is not a trial. Today is the announcement of temporary oversight authority under Section 4.2. Malcolm Price leaned closer to Preston and spoke very quietly. A reporter asked, "Mrs. Coleman, are you accusing Mr. Kane of personally profiting from the employee pension fund?" Renee straightened the complaint beneath the camera. "I am explaining why a temporary oversight board took effect at 9 o'clock this morning. Any criminal allegations, if there are any, belong to prosecutors and investigators." Elliot Bramwell looked at her when he heard that sentence. He knew she could have said more. He also knew why she did not. Renee only needed to let the documents stand in the right place, in front of the right people at the right time. The large lobby screen, which usually showed stock prices and Kane Meridian logistics projects, flickered and switched to a video call interface. The name Dr. Patricia Ashworth appeared under the frame. She appeared in an office with bookshelves behind her, silver hair cut to her shoulders, thin frame glasses, and a dark blue blazer. Nothing on her face suggested she had been caught by surprise. She had arrived exactly on schedule. Renee turned slightly toward the screen. "Dr. Ashworth, we're recording from the main lobby of Kane Meridian Group. Can you confirm your role and the decision taking effect this morning?" Patricia Ashworth looked straight into the camera. "I am Patricia Ashworth, representative of the North Carolina Teachers Pension Fund Coalition, part of the institutional shareholder group holding temporary voting authority under the settlement agreement approved by the federal court." Her voice was even, clear, with no anger Preston could call personal emotion. "A Renee Coleman has been nominated by our coalition, representing more than 23,000 teachers with equity exposure to Kane Meridian Group through pension holdings, to serve as chair of the Oversight Board, effective 9 o'clock this morning. Under Section 4.2 of the settlement agreement. That sentence made several people in the lobby look directly at Renee, as if they were only now hearing what "I'm your boss" really meant. Preston turned to Malcolm. "It can't be effective if I haven't signed it." Malcolm did not answer right away. That silence answered for him. Patricia Ashhostworth continued from the screen. "Mr. Kane's personal signature is not a condition of effectiveness. The Oversight Board has authority to restrict executive statements regarding matters under investigation, require preservation of records, temporarily suspend access for any individual who may interfere with evidence, and appoint an interim company spokesperson during the oversight period." The female reporter signaled for a wide shot. The handprint on Renee's cheek, the old complaint on the counter, the large screen showing Patricia Ashworth, and Kane standing beside his private attorney all fit into one frame that could not be edited before it existed. Preston stepped forward. Otis did not block him, but his shoulders tightened. "Dr. Ashworth," Kane said, his voice recovering part of its boardroom tone. "Your fund may hold shares, but you don't understand how this business operates. Kane Meridian isn't a classroom. This is supply chain, assets, contracts, real risk." Patricia did not blink. "We understand risk, Mr. Kane. More than 23,000 of our teachers understand it too. They put retirement money into a fund they trusted would be managed honestly. When that money is placed at risk, they have the right to appoint someone who can read the records on their behalf." Renee did not look at the screen. She watched Kane's face when he heard the word teachers. He did not react to the people. He reacted only to the voting power. That was when Elliot stepped into the camera frame. No one had asked him to. That was why the movement made the lobby go quieter. Placed the blue folder beside the whistleblower complaint and opened to page 7, where a reconciliation table he had printed from the internal financial system that morning sat waiting. "I'm Elliot Bramwell, Chief Financial Officer of Kane Meridian Group." His voice was a little dry at first, so he stopped and took a sip of water. Preston looked at him with the expression that people close to power understand clearly. This is the last second to come back. Elliot did not come back. The line item originally called warehouse maintenance costs first appeared more than 22 years ago. It did not stop after Mr. Walter Coleman reported it to operations management, but continued under several different names, routed through at least 5 intermediary vendors, including 3 shell companies directly connected to accounts controlled by individuals close to Preston Kane. Elliot turned to the next page. The total identified within the current document set exceeds $11 million, not including interest, not including secondary damages tied to employee pension fund losses and financial reporting adjustments. Malcolm Price closed his eyes for half a second. Preston turned toward Elliot. "You're incriminating yourself." Elliot gave a very small nod. "I know." It sounded like a man who had already calculated the cost of the truth and knew he no longer had the right to pretend he hadn't seen the bill. "I signed certain approvals. I didn't ask follow-up questions when I should have, and I stayed quiet when Walter Coleman was pushed out of the company 3 months before full pension eligibility." Elliot looked at Renee. "I can't repair that with a sentence, but I can stop denying it on camera." Renee did not thank him. Not then. A thank you would have made something lighter that did not yet have the right to be light. She only looked down at the old complaint, where Walter's full name did not appear because 6 years earlier she had still been trying to protect the identity of her dead father. Preston stood straighter. He adjusted his tie again, slower this time. "I did not build anything illegal here." He looked directly at the reporter instead of Renee. "Every decision was mine to make. This board does not understand how businesses like mine actually operate. You people are turning a few ordinary management decisions into a conspiracy. Restructuring is part of business. Cost evaluation is part of business. People who can't handle pressure often try to turn personal failure into a moral story." The words personal failure moved across the lobby and reached Otis before they reached Renee. Otis's hand tightened at his side, but he did not speak. Renee folded the complaint partway, then opened it again and smoothed the edge of the paper. "You didn't need to build anything illegal, Mr. Kane," she said. "You inherited enough that you never needed to build much at all." Preston snapped his eyes toward her. Renee continued, her voice still low. "All you had to do was fire a warehouse manager after 22 years, 3 months before he qualified for his full pension, and never imagine that his daughter would read the file. For a few seconds after that sentence, no one asked another question. The cameras kept rolling. The screen still held Patricia Ashworth's image. Elliot looked down at the counter. Otis looked toward the glass doors, not to avoid Renee, but to keep too much from showing on his face. Preston gave a faint, sharp smile. So that's what this is? Revenge for your father? Renee looked at him the way an attorney looks at a self-destructing question. If this were revenge, I'd be talking about the slap first. She pointed to the complaint. I'm talking about dates, transaction codes, pension records, voting authority, and an approved settlement. You're the one who keeps trying to make everything personal, because personal emotion is easier to mock than evidence. Patricia Ashworth spoke from the screen. Under the authority of the Oversight Board, I am directing internal security to execute Section 4.2 immediately. A man in a black suit stepped out from behind the HR group, who was the head of internal security, who had reported directly to the Temporary Oversight Board since 9 o'clock that morning. He stopped in front of Preston, maintaining proper corporate security distance, not touching him unless necessary. Mr. Kane, under the direction of the Oversight Board, we are asking you to surrender your executive access card, company devices, and leave the building while the investigation continues. Your attorney may accompany you. Legal will send further instructions in writing. Preston looked at him as if he had just realized the floor beneath his feet had changed owners without telling him. You work for me. The head of security answered without raising his voice. Not this morning, sir. Malcolm Price lightly touched Preston's arm. Preston, don't say anything else. This time, Kane did not shake him off. He removed the executive access card from the leather clip near his belt and placed it on the reception counter. The sound of plastic against stone was almost too small to matter, but several employees nearby still heard it. Kane walked toward the glass doors. No one shouted, no one clapped. The quiet made the distance from the reception desk to the entrance feel far longer than it did on any ordinary day. As he passed Otis, Kane waited for a look, an old sign of submission or fear. Otis did not look at him. He looked straight through the doors where morning sunlight hit the front steps outside the lobby. Preston stopped for half a beat, then kept walking. Malcolm walked beside him, speaking under his breath in words the microphone did not catch. The glass door opened, then closed behind the man whose name was on the building. Inside the lobby, Patricia Ashworth ended the call after confirming that the legal team would take control of the 12th floor conference room. Reporters began asking questions, but Renee lifted one hand lightly. There will be an official statement in 10 minutes. First, we need to preserve the records. That sentence was not for the camera. It was for the company. Elliot nodded and turned to IT, instructing them to lock Kane's executive access according to procedure. Marissa finally lowered the phone, her hand shaking more now than when she had been recording. Otis stepped closer to Renee but did not ask whether her cheek hurt. He only said, "Your father didn't like noise." Renee looked down at the complaint in her hand. I know. She still stood in the lobby where the slap had happened, where 6 years of records had finally found a voice, where justice did not make her happy the way people might imagine, only made something inside her ease a little, as if for the first time in years she could breathe without asking anyone's permission. That same afternoon, Renee Coleman did not walk into the CEO's office on the top floor, even though security had handed her the temporary key right after Preston Kane left the building. That office looked down over downtown Charlotte, with a large wooden desk and photographs of Preston shaking hands with donors. Renee stood outside the door for less than 10 seconds, looked at the Preston Kane nameplate still mounted on the wall, then handed the envelope back to the head of security. Lock this office until the audit team is finished. The man asked where she wanted to work. Renee pointed down the hall. The small conference room near HR glass door. No need to clear anything out. That conference room seated 6 people, with an old wall-mounted screen, cold coffee in a pot, and a few swivel chairs. Renee placed the yellowed copy of the whistleblower complaint on the table beside her laptop, then pulled out a chair and sat down. Her left cheek still stung when she drank water, but she did not hold ice against it in front of the employees. Not because she was trying to look strong, but because the whole company had already seen enough of her face that morning. The first thing she requested was not a press statement, not the removal of Kane's name from the lobby, and not a change to executive office access. She called in the acting head of HR, a woman named Dana Mills, who had stood in the crowd that morning and had barely spoken for the next 2 hours. Renee said, I need the list of every employee terminated over the past 10 years under the reason operational structuring, or any equivalent wording, within 6 months before reaching pension eligibility. Dana did not ask why. Maybe she had already guessed. She only opened her laptop, logged into the HR system, and said the search might take a few hours because some records were in archive storage. Renee nodded. I'll be here. At 4:38 p.m. the first list arrived, 47 names. Renee did not skim it. She enlarged the screen, placed a blank sheet of paper beside it, and read each line as if every name needed permission to enter the room before the next number appeared. Walter Coleman was not on this list because his file was more than 10 years old, but everything about the list carried the same rhythm. They were warehouse managers, inventory clerks, long-haul drivers, dispatch coordinators, maintenance technicians, night shift workers. 47 people, all leaving the company within 180 days before full benefits. At the 12th name, Renee stopped. Marlene Price, first floor inventory clerk, the woman who used to keep a box of butter cookies in her drawer, because she knew Renee skipped meals when she was still a junior accountant. The 21st name was Daryl Hinton, a driver who had once helped Walter change a tire in the parking lot after a rainy shift. The 36th was Angela Reed, a payroll employee who had quietly shown Renee how to read employee insurance deductions the year she first joined the company. Those 3 names were no longer data. They carried the smell of break room coffee, the sound of a printer jam, lunch containers turning in the old microwave. Renee placed a star beside each name, then kept reading. When Dana brought in the detailed files, Renee did not ask who had approved those decisions. She knew the answer would be in the approval chain. What she needed first were the names, dates, job titles, months missing, and benefits lost. Near 6 o'clock, Otis Meade knocked on the small conference room door. He had changed out of his security jacket into a white shirt, but still wore his name tag because his shift had not officially ended. Renee looked up from the list. "Come in, Uncle Otis." He did not sit right away. He stood beside the door, both hands in front of him, as if entering an executive conference room still required permission, even though that morning he had stood between her and the CEO. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. "I know you probably have a lot of people wanting to see you today." Renee closed her laptop halfway. "You don't have to start like that with me." Otis looked at the chair, then sat on the edge of it without leaning back. He looked at the whistleblower complaint on the table for a while. "Walter used to tell me little Renee read payroll sheets closer than grown. Folks read their electric bills." He said it like he wasn't bragging, but he was bragging. Renee looked down at her hands. Otis continued, his voice still low. "If your father were alive, he'd be proud." She had heard that sentence all day in different forms, from reporters, from lawyers, from people in the shareholder coalition. But when Otis said it, it did not sound like politeness. It sounded like someone who had once stood beside Walter at the vending machine, borrowed a screwdriver from him, and knew the way he smiled when he talked about his daughter. Renee swallowed before asking, "Proud because I have power?" Otis shook his head. "No, Walter didn't believe too much in power. He'd be proud because you didn't forget why you started." That sentence stayed on the table longer than any file. Renee did not say thank you right away. She only opened the laptop again and turned the screen toward Otis. "I found 47 names." Otis looked at the list. When he saw Daryl Hinton's name, his hand stopped on the edge of the table. "I used to go fishing with him." Renee handed him a pen. "Then help me remember who they were." Elliot Bramwell arrived at the conference room at 7:12 p.m., no tie on anymore. His attorney came with him, but stayed in the hallway after Renee said the meeting would be formally recorded and sent to the legal team. Elliot stepped inside holding a thin folder. Renee did not offer coffee. He did not ask for any. He placed the folder on the table. "I listed the files I can confirm and the accounts I know are connected." Renee looked at the folder but did not open it right away. "You understand cooperation doesn't erase the approvals you signed, right?" Elliot nodded. "I understand. I'm going to recommend a conditional leniency agreement to prosecutors. You provide documents, testify fully, and during the internal hearing, you publicly apologize to the employees who were harmed. Not to the company, not to shareholders, to them." Elliot looked toward the screen, where the list of 47 names was still open. He did not ask if it could be private or in writing instead of face-to-face. Only said, "I'll do it." The name of the program was decided close to 9 p.m., when only Renee, Dana, Otis, and 2 oversight board attorneys remained in the conference room. One person suggested Retirement Rights Review Program. Another suggested Employee Pension Recovery Fund. Renee listened to all of it, her pen resting across her fingers. Then she looked at the old whistleblower complaint, then at the list of 47 people. Call it the Walter Coleman Pension Restoration Initiative. No one spoke for a few seconds. One attorney asked if she was sure because the press might frame it as making the case personal. Renee nodded. Good. This case has been made impersonal for too long. People were pushed out of this company under the language of restructuring. I want employees who read the name of this program to remember that a warehouse manager, once treated as forgettable, had a name. Otis turned his face away a little and used a handkerchief to wipe his glasses, even though they were not dirty. 3 months later, the Oversight Board's first public hearing took place in the second-floor auditorium, where Kane Meridian had once held holiday parties and productivity awards. The stage had been cleared. There was no large banner, only a white screen with Walter Coleman Pension Restoration Initiative written in black letters. Representatives from the 47 families filled the first 3 rows. Some arrived in wheelchairs, some carried old files in plastic bags, and some did not know where to put their hands when the internal camera pointed toward them. Otis sat in the front row wearing a gray suit Renee had told him not to buy new unless he wanted to, but he bought it anyway. The nameplate in front of him read, Otis Mead, Workforce Dignity Advisor. When Renee had asked why he wanted an employee advisory role on the Oversight Board, Otis had only asked whether it would help workers be heard before they were called into HR. Renee said that was exactly the point. He accepted. Renee stepped up to the podium with a stack of papers, no long speech. Elliot Bramwell sat in the right side row, waiting for his testimony and apology. He was not looking down at his phone. Renee opened the list. Today we will read every name. If the family or representative of that person is here, please stand if you wish. You do not have to. She read the first name, Marlene Price. An older woman in the second row stood, one hand resting on her son's shoulder. Renee paused long enough for the room to see her, not as a claimant, not as a file code, but as a person. Daryl Hinton, a man in a denim jacket, stood up, holding his cap against his chest. Otis looked at him and gave a slow nod. Angela Reed. A young woman stood in for her mother, eyes red but back straight. Renee kept reading. Each name was given a pause, not long enough to become performance, but long enough not to be swallowed. By the 47th name, her voice had gone a little rough. Dana pushed a glass of water toward the podium. Renee took a sip, then looked down at the first row. The Oversight Board has approved a process to restore pension rights, reimburse eligible losses, and review every personnel decision made within 6 months before full benefit eligibility. This is not a gift from Kane Meridian. This is returning what was taken under names that sounded legal. Elliot stood after that. His apology was not long. He said he had signed, stayed quiet, chosen career safety over the truth, and that not one sentence he said today could make up for the years that had been lost. Some people did not look at him, some did. Renee let both reactions exist in the room, because justice does not require victims to be polite right away. After the hearing, Renee stayed in the auditorium until the seats were almost empty. Otis stepped onto the stage and stood beside the screen bearing Walter Coleman's name. He'd hate seeing his name up this high, Otis said. Renee looked at the words on the screen. I know, but he'd read every one of those names first. Renee folded the list and placed it into her briefcase beside the old whistleblower complaint. This time the complaint did not sit on top. The list of 47 people did. She turned off the auditorium lights and walked out into the hallway with Otis. Outside the glass doors, Charlotte had lit up for the night. The building still carried the name Kane Meridian, but inside, for the first time in a long while, another name had begun changing the way this place remembered the people who had passed through it. This story is not about a slap, even though that is the moment people will remember first. The slap was only the loudest sound in a chain of things that had happened very quietly. Before it, there were 6 years of one woman quietly teaching herself a new profession. Reading reports most people ignored after page 2, matching company addresses, maintenance fees, and dry transaction codes one line at a time. She did not do it because she was certain she would win. There were years when she did not even know whether anyone had read her complaint, but she kept the file open because her father had left her with one sentence simpler than any legal argument. Don't let them think people like me are invisible. Preston Kane believed power was something built into a bloodline. He grew up inside a building with his last name on it, sat in a chair prepared for him, and thought the people in the warehouse, at the security desk, in payroll, and on the night trucks were only the background of his story. What he did not calculate was that justice can sometimes be as patient as arrogance. It did not arrive the day Walter was fired. It did not arrive the night Renee clicked submit at 2 a.m. It did not even arrive when her father died, but it remembered. It moved through files, through witnesses, through people who had once stayed quiet and finally chose to tell the truth. Perhaps the most painful aspect of this story is how many people were forced to live for years as a small line in a spreadsheet. The most healing part, however, was that their names were eventually read aloud, one by one, slowly enough for the entire room to see. If this story reminded you of someone who was once considered invisible, please leave their name or a brief reminder in the comments. Please share this video with someone who needs a little more faith in life, and remember to subscribe to Single Mom Billionaire Story to stay with us.